This is the Asia Trade. I'm Paul Allen in Sydney.
I'm Avril Hong in Kuala Lumpur for the ASEAN Leader Summit. The top stories this hour. President Trump due to meet Japan's Prime Minister in Tokyo shortly, with military and business ties top of the agenda. Trump's Asia trip raising hopes for a China trade deal and boosting risk sentiment ahead of this week's likely Fed rate cut. Qualcomm shares jump as it takes aim at Nvidia with new chips and computers for the lucrative AI data center market. Plus, Korean defense manufacturer Hanwha Aerospace tells us exclusively how they're navigating Chinese sanctions and Beijing's dominance in rare earths.
All right, we're just open for trade here in Australia. Let's take a look at how we're tracking. We're off about 1/3 of 1% at the moment. A little bit of softness there for the ASX. One of the worst performing stocks right now is, in fact, CSL, the pharmaceutical giant. That's off by about 13-12% at the moment. This is after it announced that it's no longer targeting the Seqirus demerger in full year 2026, financial year 2026. CSL saying separation still the preferred approach there, but heightened volatility in the United States flu vaccination market means the timing for that demerger not quite right. So CSL off by 13% at the moment. Elsewhere, we've got Nikkei futures still looking pretty good. We saw Japan's main index punching above the 50,000 point level. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in town at the time said he was honoured to be there for that. Also heaping praise on the efforts of the new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi and her finance minister as well, saying that it's really helping to propel Japanese stocks higher. Perhaps helped along to some degree by the extremely weak yen, though, as well, 152.76 at the moment. Now, let's take a look at breaking news out of South Korea also, because we've just had third quarter GDP numbers. We were expecting a pretty good read here, and it has, in fact, beaten expectations. 1.7% growth on year for the quarter, 1.2% growth in the third quarter. So that builds on the strong momentum that we saw in the second quarter. We've seen a number of things happen. Consumer confidence improving, private and government consumption both strengthening, and spending from the July budget also starting to show up in the data now. Exports have been very resilient for South Korea as well. Robust semiconductor demand, and there's plans to boost defence spending also. So plenty of tailwinds for the Korean economy at the moment, and that being reflected in that strong, better than expected third quarter GDP data. Let's move on to President Trump. He's due to hold his first face-to-face meeting with Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, in Tokyo. That's in the coming hour. Now, as I mentioned, their Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier told his Japanese counterpart that Takaichi's expansionary fiscal stance does seem to be helping stocks. Let's get live now to Tokyo and our chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel. So, Steve, a lot of anticipation building behind this Trump-Takaichi meeting. What's on the agenda today?
Well, there's lots to talk about, no doubt, including, of course, the backdrop of the developments in Malaysia with the framework agreement with the Chinese. So I'm sure that Donald Trump will be briefing Takaichi-san as well as Scott Bessent when he talks to the finance minister about the parameters for which Donald Trump will go to APEC and the sidelines of APEC and meet with Xi Jinping. And what does that mean, obviously, for the greater East Asia, including Japan. So there are geopolitical issues that the United States will talk with Takaichi-san about. Defense spending, obviously a big issue. Takaichi-san would like to increase at a quicker pace the percentage of defense spending as to GDP to 2%, faster than expected. The issue of Japan's purchases of Russian LNG will clearly be a topic that Donald Trump will bring up. Also, the overriding threat of North Korea could be an interesting topic as well. As far as those financial issues, no doubt, Takaichi-san possibly, I mean, I shouldn't say no doubt, possibly will bring up that July trade deal, which is cemented in the last month or two, that essentially secured a 15%, a relatively low 15% compared to others, tariff in exchange for a $550 billion Japanese investment fund into the United States. We don't have a lot of clarity on the details of that fund and what is in it and what it will invest in. Perhaps later in this bilateral meeting, which we expect to start about 9:30 Japanese time between Trump and Takaichi-san. We could get more clarity on what will that $550 billion investment fund entail. So lots to discuss in a short stay for Donald Trump before he heads off to South Korea, I believe, tomorrow morning.
And before the Japanese and U.S. Leaders actually meet, we already saw a sort of prelude with the finance chief of Japan and the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. You alluded to some of this. What else did they talk about?
Well, Scott Bessent essentially said that the pro-stimulus and expansionary policies of Takaichi-san seem to be sending the right signal. Clearly, yesterday Scott Bessent and Donald Trump arrived on the day that the Nikkei 225 soared past 50,000. It's at 50,522 right now. And again, he dubbed it Sanenomics in reference to, of course, Abenomics. Abe, the slain former prime minister who was assassinated in 2022, was sort of a mentor to Takaichi-san, and Donald Trump is known to have had significant, a good relationship with Shinzo Abe. In fact, the last time Donald Trump was in Japan, he met with Prime Minister Abe in May of 2019. Also, at the Akasaka Palace, which we're assuming the bilat will be held later today. And again, it might come as a bit of a relief to Japanese authorities with Scott Bessent already meeting Satsuki Katayama and praising the expansionary policies of Takaichi-san, given the fact they're quite concerned that the Donald Trump could be bringing up the weak yen, right now trading at about 152.7.
Stephen, thank you so much for setting us up to what to expect for later today. Our Chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, in Tokyo. Now, in the meantime, also watching how Wall Street performed overnight. And it was interesting because of this détente that we're seeing between the U.S. and China. There's optimism around trade talks, so stocks hit record highs. We also saw short-end treasuries dip on these very signs of progress between the U.S. and China. We saw gold also slipping below the 4,000 handle, and then there were treasury auctions that were pretty solidly received, and all this coming in a week of central bank decisions, but also big tech earnings. Now, another one of the tech names that we are watching, of course, Qualcomm, because its shares surged to the highest in 15 months after the company unveiled new chips and computers designed for the AI data center market. It's a fresh challenge to Nvidia in the fastest growing segment of the industry. Let's cross to San Francisco and our tech editor, Nick Turner. So, Nick, talk to us about how Qualcomm is actually thinking of doing this and breaking into AI accelerators.
Yeah, I mean, it's still pretty early. They do have a big customer, Humane, the Saudi AI startup that's going to be using them. So that is kind of a breakthrough for them. They've been sort of tinkering at the edges of this market, and this is definitely a bigger push into it. But, obviously NVIDIA is dominant, and it's also not completely head-to-head competition per se. I mean, there's situations where Qualcomm chips can be used side by side with NVIDIA chips. But it's, as you say, it's such a fast-growing market. It's such a huge market that even if they can get a small chunk of it, that could be billions of dollars.
Nick, what is the plan here for rolling out across markets? And I guess critically, are they going to be allowed to export to China?
That's an interesting question. I think that it maybe is still a little too early to dig into that one, just because, they're just trying to get their feet on the ground here. I'm assuming they'll obviously have to face the same barriers that AMD and NVIDIA do, so that might be a farther out question. But I think that just sort of trying to show that they can compete is step one, and then figuring out some of those things might be the next step.
All right, tech editor Nick Turner there in San Francisco. Now, I mentioned CSL a little bit earlier, shelving temporarily, it says, these plans to spin off its vaccine producer, influenza vaccine producer Seqirus, is currently off about 14.3%. CSL saying, look, the long-term plan is still separation. That is the preferred approach to unlock growth and simplification. But CSL says heightened volatility in the US flu vaccine market means the timing for that spin-off not quite right. The market not liking it. CSL selling off pretty heavily right now, the worst performing stock on the ASX at 200. The other one you see on the board there, WiseTech. Its offices got raided on Monday here in Sydney by police and market regulators. The investigation concerns alleged trading in WiseTech shares by its billionaire and co-founder Richard White, as well as 3 company employees between late 2024 and early 2025. That's according to a WiseTech statement filed to the ASX. So WiseTech saying no charges have been laid yet, but stock right now off almost 12%. Still to come on the Asia trade, we're going to talk market strategy with Goldman Sachs and UBS as risk sentiment gets a lift from the Trump-Xi meeting and the likely Fed rate cut. Also, we'll take a closer look at President Trump's trip to Tokyo with Japan Foresight. Much more ahead. This is Bloomberg. Yes, the Fed decides. It's made its way down the news agenda. Such a news-heavy week at the moment, but you see on that chart there that the strong expectation is we will see a 25 basis point reduction at this week's meeting. So to discuss this some more, let's get to our next guest. Simon Dangoor, Head of Fixed Income Macro Strategies at Goldman Sachs Asset Management, joins us here in Sydney. Thanks, Simon.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I'm sure you're in the camp that we're going to see that 25 basis points worth of easing this week. But the question is what's after that, and how confident are you that inflation risk has receded now?
So I think we get 25 basis points this week. We think we'll get another 25 basis points in December. It's actually unclear how much more data the Fed's going to have about the economy once we get to December. It really depends when the government reopens. But on most cases, we think that both of those are largely speaking locked in. I think when you look into 2026, the picture gets a little less clear. And really it depends whether the labour market holds through this period of weakness that we've seen into an environment where the effect of the Fed cutting rates now, as well as a stock market that continues to support consumption at the high end, could mean that you could have something of an improvement of the economy and potentially somewhat less than what's priced. But for now, we think the Fed's in cutting mode. On inflation, as you asked, actually, we think the story on inflation has been good over the course of the last several months. The number on Friday played into that as well. If you look at things like housing costs, they're starting to normalise. Wages are very behaved in the US economy. So whilst the tariffs are passing through the system, the broader inflation picture actually does allow the Fed to be very labour market focused at the moment.
Well, we've talked a lot about that half of the mandate over what feels like years now. But what about the job side of things? Because we've just had the news today, Reuters reporting that Amazon's going to cut 30,000 workers. That's about 10% of its corporate workforce. AI being given as the reason. Do you expect to see more of this and jobs to become the greater theme for the Fed going forward?
Well, I think you're sort of alluding to the fact that so far what we've been dealing with is a sort of low hiring, low firing equilibrium, and everyone's watching for this scenario where you actually might get some job losses. That would be a much more serious proposition for the Fed. We think that sort of this question of AI and job losses is something which the market is going to have to deal with over the next couple of years. From a broad macro perspective, there just isn't enough adoption of AI across the broad economy to see that being something which is widespread. That said, there's probably some evidence, if it's only anecdotal, that companies have been slowing down hiring as they see what they can do with AI, but more that than, let's say, than clear job losses at this point. But clearly for now, the labour market is key for where the Fed is going to go. Watch jobless claims every week. I think that'll be an interesting indicator to get a sense of whether there's some sort of pickup in layoffs going on.
You raise an interesting point about the lack of data potentially coming beyond December because of the US government shutdown. But talk to us also, how do you position along the curve with treasuries amid these uncertainties beyond this year into 2026 on the labour market?
Well, we think that the Treasury market is, roughly speaking, fairly priced at the moment. And really, the action in rates is outside of the US, where you see sort of more opportunities to see rates coming lower in some of the smaller open economies that are still digesting the effect of the trade shock, which will have some effect in terms of trade diversion, resulting in sort of lower goods prices, as well as a number of different other factors, like, for instance, the fiscal tightening, which is playing out in the UK. Most fiscal authorities are still sort of running reasonably loose policy. The UK is one place we're actually going to see some fiscal tightening in 26. That can create an environment where rates can come lower. So for us, as we're thinking about taking risk in our global rates portfolios, the focus right now is less on the US, more in the rest of the world. But I think you're also alluding to the question of curve. Curve has been a very big theme this year. Curve has steepened a lot. We've liked curve steepness. Here, I think the position is more nuanced, and the back end of the curve will probably see demand around this 4% area. Again, when we look around the rest of the world, there's more cases for curve steepening in Europe. You're going to have the Dutch pension funds continuing to pay the back end of the yield curve. And we expect that the ECB could cut rates again as we move through the early parts of next year. So steepness is more for us a European theme than a US theme.
When you talk about fiscal expansion, one place where we are, I guess, seeing it, I mean, you talked about fiscal tightening, but we're seeing fiscal expansion potentially in Japan. How does that then fit into your global rates portfolio?
Japan is one of our strongest held views in our global rates portfolio, and we think that what's playing out in Japan right now only adds to that view. The BOJ is very undemandingly priced when you look at what's priced into the next couple of years. And the risk management for the proposition for the Bank of Japan has really changed here, because underlying inflation in Japan really does look like it's reached 2%. And in that backdrop, rates down at 50 basis points just really doesn't make any sustainable sense. It's interesting to see how the wage round in Japan is going to play out into the next year. We had very early results on where that wage round might play out, and they are sort of suggesting that we might have something that's even stronger than we saw last year. So that strengthening domestic wages, that improving underlying inflation, if you then throw in an additional fiscal ease, is going to result in the Bank of Japan having to hike more than what's currently priced in. So we like being underweight Japanese rates. We like flatness in Japan as well, where the back end of the curve already has quite a lot of risk premium.
Okay, Simon, thank you for talking us through your strategy. Simon Dangoor is Head of Fixed Income Macro Strategies at Goldman Sachs Asset Management. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Korean defense manufacturer Hanwha Aerospace says it remains optimistic about opportunities in the U.S. despite China's sanctions on its American subsidiary. Global Chief Strategy Officer Alex Wong told us exclusively about their plans to diversify supply chains.
We're aware of the sanctions announced by China on Hanwha's USA subsidiaries, and we're reviewing what that impact will be going forward. But I think the story here is, whether it's from the Chinese perspective, whether it's from the Korean perspective, whether it's from the U.S. perspective, this really highlights the significant role that Hanwha plays in shipbuilding and the role that we can play in the growing cooperation between Korea and the United States as allies on shipbuilding. We have technological capabilities, advanced manufacturing capabilities, sheer industrial scale, where we really can, as the two leaders, President Lee and President Trump have said, make American shipbuilding great again. And we'll see when President Lee and President Trump meet here in Gyeongju whether there's more shape brought to that MOSGA deal. And we stand ready to provide support to that and ready to implement that cooperation.
But Hanwha has been so ambitious when it comes to the U.S. Navy shipbuilding potential. Does this sort of restrict or give you pause for thought?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity in the United States on shipbuilding, whether that's on naval ships, whether that's on maintenance and repair of naval ships. We've done one of those in our Okpo yard in South Korea. But we're also looking at expanding and modernizing the Philadelphia shipyard, the most historic shipyard in the United States, which we acquired last year. As we build out capacity there, with a goal of moving it from 2 ships a year capacity to 20 ships a year if we reach our objectives. objective, that provides a lot of opportunity, whether for naval ship repair, maintenance, even construction, or commercial ocean-going shipbuilding.
How is Hanwha affected by China's restrictions on rare earths, which of course are widely used in the defense industry?
Right. Well, I think every company and every country in the world is looking at the possible implications of those restrictions. As you say, they are an upstream input into a number of industries, not just defense, but it's something, as a defense company that we'll look at, as will every other defense company in the world. But as you know, Sherry, that's going to be a topic of conversation here between President Trump and President Xi when they meet here in Gyeongju, and we'll see what the outcome is of that.
Where does Hanwha source rare earths from, and is it impacting the way that you think about supply chains?
Well, we think about supply chains from a security perspective as well. What can we do to source, whether it's rare earths, whether it's our steel, whether it's our other technological and commodity inputs, in a way that it makes us resilient, and therefore we can deliver for our customers. I'll give you an example. We are the #1 maker of artillery systems, the #1 howitzer in the world, sold to many countries, and nearly half of those inputs are actually U.S. sourced. And then sourced from Korea and other nations. So we're looking to diversify the inputs into all of our products, again, for security reasons.
But China takes up most of the sourcing when it comes to rare earths. Are you diversifying?
Well, I think every country and every company in the world is looking at that. But you're right. China has a very dominant and very strong position in the refining of rare earths. And if you look, whether it's at the United States, whether it's Europe, whether it's APEC economies, how do we all look at that supply chain, strengthen it, and strengthen the resilience of countries and companies around the world, again, from a national security perspective, but just for the health of the world economy.
I spoke to President Lee Jae-myung, who talked about that defense spending being raised to 3.5% of GDP. We have Japan also doing the same. What sort of opportunities does this present as we're seeing more spending across the defense industries?
For Hanwha, I think this presents a real opportunity. We are the top defense contractor here in Korea. So any kind of increase in top-line defense, we would look to provide those services to the government and to the military of Korea. But I want to note that Korea's move here and Japan's move and Taiwan's move is a part of a global trend. I note that in the NATO countries earlier this year, collectively, jointly agreed to move to 5% of GDP in defense spending. That is also an opportunity for Hanwha. We're looking to help rearm Europe. We're looking to help provide them with the munitions, the artillery, the hardware, and the technology, the next generation technology they need to rearm and reestablish deterrence there in Europe.
That's Hanwha Aerospace's Alex Wong speaking exclusively to our co-anchor Sherry Ann there. This is Bloomberg. All right, let's take a look at how we're tracking on major markets at the moment. We are, of course, open here in Australia. Just a little bit of softness, and really a lot of that is to do with CSL. This is worth about 4 or 5% of the ASX by weight in terms of market cap, and CSL's off pretty heavily at the moment, down by about 13-14% after delaying the spin-off of its Seqirus vaccine unit. Take a look at Nikkei futures, though. Quieter day today. They're kind of flat at the moment, but we did power through that 50,000-point barrier yesterday. S&P E-mini futures, meanwhile, positioned up by about 0.1%. Safe to say there's quite a lot of optimism around risk assets at the moment. A lot of that has been to do with the tour of President Trump through Asia, a bit of optimism around US-China trade, which we'll get to in a moment. But President Trump also due to meet Japan's new Prime Minister, Takaichi, in Tokyo in the coming hour. Now, as I mentioned, this comes after the Nikkei surpassed that 50,000 level. fall for the first time as growth optimism does boost investor sentiment. Let's get a little bit more on this now. Bring in our Japan stocks reporter Alice French. So Alice, can we expect some more upside from here, or has potential fiscal stimulus from the Takaichi government already been priced in?
It's a good question, right? I mean, you know, as you mentioned, we moved past that 50,000 level for the first time yesterday, which is a pretty big deal here. And even just the fact that we've moved past that level seems to be driving some optimism. As you mentioned, of course, we have Trump in town, and I think there is some kind of anticipation that we might see some deals around things like defense and shipbuilding. Of course, we're also hoping that, you know, Trump and China can also come to some sort of agreement, and that seems to be fueling the positive sentiment here. But more broadly as well, you know, as you mentioned, we do have these expectations that the new Prime Minister Takaichi is going to push forward with her kind of stimulatory policies. You know, we expect her to put more money into things like defense, into things like infrastructure, tech, etc. And all of that is kind of driving that optimism. Now, as you say, we had a pretty nice rally yesterday. Whether it can kind of continue through today, I think will depend quite heavily on what comes out of that Trump and Takaichi morning meeting this morning. So let's see. You know, of course, we also know that we have earnings coming up, and I think a lot will depend on that too. But for the time being, it does seem like investors are feeling pretty optimistic, and that 50,000 level may stay.
What are the sectors that are perhaps underperforming right now that have more room for catch-up that can drive this potential next leg higher in Japanese stocks?
It's a good question, right? I mean, you know, tech and defense have been sort of the big winners here, but something that we have seen kind of pull back since Takaichi became premier are banks, right? So we know that banks had been outperforming the last year or so on expectations of rate hikes by the Bank of Japan. Now, under Takaichi, there are some expectations that those hikes might slow down, and obviously that's not the best news for the banking sector. I think a key test for that is going to come, you know, in just a couple of days' time when we have that policy announcement from the BOJ at the end of this week. Now, we are expecting that they will hold, but sort of any kind of messaging that we get from the BOJ, I think, around the potential timing of another rate hike would be good news for banks. So they do have some catching up to do, but I think things like defense and tech probably still do have a leg higher to run, and they may be the leaders of the rally as it continues forwards. And let's see what comes out of, you know, the Takaichi-Trump meetings, if we have any specific kind of agreements on those sectors. Shipbuilding as well is very much in focus and has been one of the best performers since Trump came into office. So let's see sort of how the sectors play out. But I think banks are something that people will be watching to see sort of the pace of this rally and how much further it really can go, and potentially could be kind of pulling things back a little bit if we get some kind of cautious messaging from the BOJ later this week.
Okay, watch the banks. Alice, always good to chat. Thank you. Our Bloomberg Japan stocks reporter Alice French for us. Meantime, we're shining the spotlight on Chinese bonds as well. State media reports say the PBOC will restart its sovereign bond trading operations after a hiatus, and they say this may be aimed at supporting the debt market and boosting liquidity. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Min Lo. So, Min Min, we've already been seeing some reaction in the bond market to this. Talk to us about why the PBOC is seeing fit for resumption of government bond trading.
That's right, Avril. If you look at the bond market yesterday, especially the 10-year yield, it's dropped by about 5 basis points, closing at 1.8% yesterday. And this comes after state media reported, quoting the PBOC Governor Pang Gongsheng, saying that the PBOC will resume bond trading. Now, if you recall, back in January, the PBOC had halted bond trading because we saw those bond yields falling to record lows over pessimism in the economy. But we sort of have the opposite problem today because of this exuberance in the stock market. It led to a sell-off in the bond market as people rotated away from bonds into stocks. And so the PBOC governor is saying that the market risks that they were worried about in January, that has largely diminished. The market has recovered well enough that they can now participate in bond trading again. Now, obviously, this is going to inject more liquidity into the market. It could potentially reduce the spread between the 10-year, between the long and short-term yield. And you can see on the screen there, the yellow sort of circle, that big drop towards the end of that curve. And analysts are saying that maybe this could encourage more investors to join in the bond market. And clearly the PBOC also trying to balance between stability in the stocks and bond markets in China.
Min Min, we've also heard from a former PBOC advisor urging China to weigh a mega stimulus to boost growth. What's he saying, and how likely is that to happen?
Yeah, this is coming from Yu Yongding, who is a former PBOC advisor. He spoke to us at the sidelines of the Bund Summit last weekend in Shanghai. And he is proposing that China should inject this mega investment plan similar to what we saw in 2008 to stave off recession that was triggered by the global financial crisis. Now, remember, that was a 4 trillion yuan program, about 12% of GDP at the time. In today's world, it would be equivalent to about 16 trillion yuan. That's a huge stimulus. He says that even though the government has been trying to boost consumption, and we saw those policies starting to take effect, but still the gap is too large, and infrastructure investment, he says, is still the fastest way to boost growth. But this probably differs. There are probably two camps in China right now, right? There are some other economists, especially given what we heard from the communique from the fourth plenum as well. Some economists saying that consumption should be the priority instead of investment, especially given the overcapacity that we're seeing in China. Huang Yiping, that's another PBOC advisor, is saying that China needs to balance between investment and consumption, because what we saw now after the big stimulus in 2008, we are suffering now from the side effects of that, the debt overhang, the property bubble, and the like. And so, yes, perhaps a bit of debate in the government right now, but that is a huge stimulus that so far in recent years we have seen the Chinese government been a little bit cautious on, given some of the concerns around debt and the debt burden for local governments.
Right, and with the US-China data maybe giving policymakers a bit of wiggle room, breathing space to focus on the domestic economy. Min Min, thank you so much. Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Min Lo. Now, some other global headlines we are following. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum says the U.S. is extending a deadline to reach a trade deal by several weeks. Sheinbaum says both she and President Trump agreed to extend talks to give both nations more time to reach an agreement on non-tariff trade barriers. Trump earlier set a November 1st deadline to raise tariffs on certain Mexican goods from 25 to 30%. Hurricane Melissa heading towards Jamaica as a powerful Category 5 storm, threatening to bring widespread destruction to the island. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says winds have the potential to bring down buildings. Authorities are also warning of catastrophic flooding, with the storm expected to dump up to a meter of rain across parts of Jamaica. Now, coming up on the Asia trade, former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Rohirrim CEO Stephen Aberle join us live to discuss how governments are using AI to accelerate acquisition and contracting decisions. This is Bloomberg.
Let's take a look at some Australian assets are tracking, particularly bonds, where we're anticipating Australian bond sales to hit new highs this year. We're already at a year-to-date record, up about 1% in 2025 to $184 billion US dollars. Australia, of course, one of the few countries with a AAA rating. We've seen Asian investors particularly boosting their Australia-denominated allocation as well. So a bit of strength there for the bond market. Stocks are a little bit flat here in Australia right now. That's really an idiosyncratic story to do with CSL, the pharmaceutical company. We'll unpack that a little bit for you later on. But for now, we want to turn our focus to AI and a company that's seeking to change how governments and enterprises accelerate acquisition and contracting decisions. And joining us here in the studio, we have a double header for you. The former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who's joining us alongside Rohirrim's newly formed International Advisory Board. And with us is the CEO of Rohirrim, Stephen Avril. Stephen, I just want to pick up with you. Can you just, in a nutshell, tell us about your business, give us an example of the use of your technology?
Yeah, thank you. And it's an honor to be here, Paul. So we exist really to build technology that provides acquisition power to America and its allies to ensure deterrence is really the core of exactly what we do. We have technology that's deployed out to multiple U.S. government agencies that take the acquisition process from what is sometimes years and collapses that down to months, again, to close the capability gap and provide deterrence.
So AI tools, however, often get criticised for not getting things 100%
That's right.
Now, you're dealing with pretty serious stuff here, defence, acquisition, that kind of thing. Do you have a human on the back end?
There's always a human in control, really, especially when it comes to acquisition. But there are ways that you can utilize artificial intelligence. There are ways that you can build and train the technology to ensure the results, the output that you're looking at are always sourced, are always accurate, are always verifiable. And that's, again, really kind of the core of the technology that we generate for large governments and large enterprises.
Well, you've attracted some high-profile talent sitting next to you, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. So can I ask you, Malcolm, you're the chair of the advisory board. What attracted you to this company? What's your role going to be?
Well, giving good advice, I hope, but I was very excited to get to know Steve and Rohirrim, and not simply because I'm a Lord of the Rings fan, but
someone had to say it.
Exactly, someone had to say it. But the reality is one of the biggest barriers for us, Australia, and our allies, including the US, to acquire the capabilities we need to deter our adversaries is the slow pace of acquisition. And, you know, this is not just anecdata. I mean, I obviously experienced this when I was in government, but our own audit office in Australia recently confirmed that of our 20 largest projects in defence, they were running on an average of 2 years late. And now part of the problem is, in order to comply with the acquisition processes legally and equitably and so forth, takes a lot of time. If you can use AI to do the things that, frankly, the humans don't need to do, and reserve those very talented and very scarce human talent, because remember, they've all got to have high security classifications, clearances. The AI can make that, as Steve says, collapse what takes years into months. And if we can't do that, we simply won't be able to keep up with our rivals. So I think this is mission critical.
Well, typically when we see high-profile politicians, former prime ministers such as yourself, taking up positions in the corporate world, you're there to open doors and lobby to a degree. Are there any doors that you've been opening and any regulatory framework changes that you're pushing for?
Well, I'm certainly happy to assist, but I've had a long involvement in technology. I was a technology investor and venture capitalist long before I was in politics, and I was a pretty enthusiastic supporter of innovation in government when I was in government, and I remain so. So for me, this is something that I've got an interest in from as an investor, and as a matter of reforming government. I mean, it is vital that government is able to deliver at the speed of technology. Otherwise, we'll keep on falling behind.
Stephen, Malcolm is chair of your advisory board. Hiring talent like this, I'm sure, doesn't come cheap. Can you tell us a little bit about your business model, your revenue, how you make money?
Yeah, absolutely. So at our core, we're a software provider. So we have technology that we sell to large governments, large corporations, primarily in the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK, specific to both sides of the acquisition problem set, which is there's always a buyer and seller side. So we deploy technology to the commercial side that collapses the amount of time required for them, which could be months and millions of dollars, to respond to government requests for proposals or requests for tenders. And on the government side, we collapse that as well by introducing those efficiencies in the way that they choose acquisition paths, and they find both small, medium, and large-sized businesses to satisfy any given requirement.
Around AI, there's also the question of what's known as the interpretability problem. I mean, OpenAI says it doesn't even understand how its own models work.
That's correct.
To what degree are you feeding defence data and contracts and policies into a black box? Are there any risks around this?
Well, all of this is done, of course, in a sovereign way, right? So security is paramount, especially when you're dealing with classified intelligence agencies or any government agency, and that's no different here in Australia. But the technology that we have allows us, kind of in processes that we call unsupervised entailment theories, to understand exactly where this data came from, what is trusted, how can you trust it, what is the source of the data, and be able to track that all the way through the training process and then also all the way through the inference process to ensure, when it is generating probabilistic text, we get as close to deterministic as we can.
Well, we're entering an era also of geopolitical tension.
Sure.
We're seeing a lot of countries at the moment promising to or increasing their defence spending, particularly allies, as you mentioned, who are your clients. To what degree is this providing more opportunities?
So if you look at the Commonwealth procurement rule set, the laws and regulations that govern procurement and acquisition here in Australia, we're in an era that those rules and regulations never contemplated. They are 40 or 50 years old. And in the United States, if, Malcolm mentioned these auditor reports where, we're 2 years behind in certain programs. In the United States, we are building major programs in 8 to 11 year cycles, where our near-peer adversaries are iterating in 18 to 36 month cycles. And that's a significant problem. So how do you, to answer your question, how do you open the aperture to more than just, say, the large technology primes, the defense industrial base, the typical large companies that have been around for a long time, to smaller tech startups, to medium-sized companies that are building technology and services that can impact both Australia and the United States deterrence? And that is what we exist to do, to build a bridge between both the supplier side, companies that are selling technology and services to these large governments, and the government, to connect those in AI bridge.
Mm-hmm. Malcolm, of course, I want to get your views on geopolitics as well, and I've no wish to reignite your conflict on X with President Trump, but he's meeting President Xi this week. Do you anticipate any developments in terms of a trade deal or any questions over this traditional strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan?
I can't imagine that the strategic ambiguity re-Taiwan will change. I mean, Donald Trump is much less forward-leaning on Taiwan than Joe Biden was. In fact, there was an interview with Bloomberg a couple of years ago now where he expressed great skepticism about the ability to defend Taiwan. So I think I suspect he will stay exactly where he is. In terms of will they get a deal done, well, we all hope so. The market hopes so. President Trump is flagging that he expects so. So, clearly it's in both countries' interests, the world's interest, that they come to a deal. Now, Donald Trump is highly transactional. He is a deal maker. He likes doing deals. He is absolutely not a warmonger. I mean, that is one thing. I know him well enough to know, and talked about these issues with him long enough to know he's absolutely not a warmonger. Now, people might argue whether he's a good peacemaker or whether he's actually secured the peace agreements he claims, but he doesn't. He's essentially wants peace and stability, and for everyone to make lots of money, including himself. So that's that should be music to the ears of Bloomberg's audience, and I think we all want to have peace, but it's peace through strength. And this gets back to the point Steve's made, that unless we have the ability to deter our adversaries so that when they sit back and say, can we use kinetic force to, acquire this territory or force this issue, we've got to be able to put them in a position where they go, we can't be sure that we'll win, so let's just keep on, being peaceful. And that's what we want.
All right, Malcolm
Peace
Turnbull.
through strength.
Thank you so much, Malcolm Turnbull, former Prime Minister of Australia, and Stephen Abril, CEO of Rohirrim. And you can catch Australia Ahead every Tuesday. You can also tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, which delves into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. You can find that on Apple, Spotify, or Bloomberg.com. We have more ahead on the Age of Trade. This is Bloomberg.
You're watching the Asia Trade, the latest from the corporate front. Amazon shares gained in New York after reports it's planning massive job cuts. Sources tell Bloomberg the company's targeting corporate jobs in departments including logistics, payments, video games, and cloud computing. Reuters earlier reported that the terminations could come as soon as Tuesday and affect as many as 30,000 jobs. Bloomberg's been told that Paramount Skydance will begin a major round of layoffs on Wednesday with 1,000 job cuts. Our source says a second round is also expected later, with the total number previously reported at about 2,000. Paramount Skydance was created through a merger in August, and new management is moving quickly to cut costs and restructure. Paul?
Okay, we're losing a little bit of ground here on the ASX. We're off by about 1/3% right now. I have told you about how CSL, the pharmaceutical manufacturer, is taking a bit of a beating this morning. That's dragging on the wider market due to CSL's weight. Nikkei futures now just turning negative after cracking the 50,000 point barrier yesterday. The main index did, so we'll see what the future holds when we open in a few minutes' time. The yen's still pretty weak. S&P futures, meanwhile, holding on to those modest gains. Let's check in on some of the stocks to watch when trade does open in Korea and Japan shortly. Nidec faces the risk of delisting after the Tokyo Stock Exchange said it would apply special oversight on an accounting crisis. The stock now on a special alert, beginning a potentially years-long process. Separately, Nikkei says the designation means Nidec will be removed from its blue chip 225 stock average. This is Bloomberg. This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens, and we're seeing a bit of risk-on sentiment this week as Avril, things seem to improve between the US and China on the trade front, and we've also got President Trump about to meet Japan's new Prime Minister as well.
Indeed, and if all goes well, maybe we see some form of a trade agreement between the US and China on Thursday in Korea. But as you say now, the focus is going to be on how Takaichi, the Japanese Prime Minister, engages with the US President.
Yeah, and we've seen the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent heaping praise on the fiscal stimulus policies that are under consideration in Japan, describing it as Sana economics. It's a bit of a clumsy word, doesn't have quite the same ring as Abenomics, but it's the same sentiment that underpins it. And we see maybe the rally losing a little bit of steam, though. The Nikkei did break through 50,000 points for the first time yesterday, showing a little bit of a pullback at the moment by about 1/4%. Very weak yen as well, 152.67. It'll be interesting to see if the president brings that up with his upcoming meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi coming up very, very soon. We also have a Bank of Japan decision this week, and it's going to be interesting to see how board members weigh policy going forward in this new era of fiscal stimulus. Let's take a look at how stocks in Korea are tracking. Meanwhile, of course, about an hour ago, we got that very strong GDP read out of Korea for the third quarter. Better than expected, 1.7% growth on year in that quarter. We're seeing a lot of the spending measures from the budget starting to trickle through and show up in the data as well, improve consumer sentiment as well. But we're seeing the Kospi just backing off a little today, off 0.8%. No change there for the Korean won. let's take a look now at how treasuries are tracking as well. Of course, we do have a Fed decision coming up this week also. The government's still in shutdown, heading into a fifth week now in the United States. But the Fed rate cut of 25 basis points, that seems to be pretty much nailed on. We'll be really watching for commentary about what happens next. But amid this environment of enthusiasm, optimism and easing Fed, US-China trade appearing to settle down, look at the gold price. We are below $4,000 an ounce, Avril.
Yeah, you talk about all these easing tensions and the monetary policy expectations. That's really what's smoothing the equities climb along, even though we're seeing a bit of a pullback for the moment in the Asia session. Let's bring in Kelvin, Regional CIO at UBS Global Wealth Management. So as Paul was just highlighting, we're really seeing all these factors come into play. Things are looking good. What could possibly derail this?
I think the main event for these 2 weeks is basically the potential deal between China and the US. And if that is signed, then that is likely to be a pretty strong catalyst for assets to be risk on again. But if that deal for somehow, falls through in the next couple of weeks, then I think that will probably be one of the catalysts for the markets to actually again be risk off. So I think a lot of it actually hinges on that. And I think this week as well, besides the FOMC and the BOJ that you were talking about, there are also a series of very important results coming up from the US corporates too. And if the Big Five or the Big Six come up with very sterling results, seizing on the AI growth in the US at this point in time, then obviously that will prove to be another very, very strong catalyst for the markets too.
Kelvin, which sectors or asset classes would be most vulnerable if we see things maybe not come through on the US-China front as things have been teed up between the US and Chinese trade negotiators so far?
Yeah, I think in general it's beta driven. So if the deal actually doesn't come through, you're going to get a top-down sell-off of basically almost everything in the US and in China itself. It's basically a top-down liquidity flow kind of event. So we do expect the tech sector, probably there will be some profit taking there, given the fact that they've actually recovered very strongly since the bottom in April this year. I think if you talk about Liberation Day to now, the Big Seven or the Big Six have actually recovered by almost 65%. So that's basically what's driving the US equity markets at the moment. So if things derail where the deal is concerned, then obviously there'll be quite a fair bit of profit taking on that. And don't forget about the Chinese stocks as well, because until now a lot of the tech stocks in China has also done really, really well, especially the Hang Seng Tech Index. And there will be some vulnerability there too if the deal doesn't come through.
Kelvin, to your point on Chinese tech, and we do have a chart that illustrates this as well, it's really been a terrific, year or a few months for Chinese tech stocks. I know you really, really like this sector, but when you look at the run-up, do you buy at these levels?
We still think that they are attractive because I think compared to where they were before, compared to the previous high, I think the Chinese tech sector has still some room to go. And the results have actually been pretty good where the second quarter results are concerned. So we're all eagerly watching the third quarter to see whether the results are still keeping in pace and whether that path is sustainable. And if it is, then obviously there's still some room for the Hang Seng Tech and especially the Chinese tech stocks to actually run. But what we do like right now is also the broader index. And we've actually recently upgraded China to attractive, given the fact that valuations are still very attractive and that the growth, earnings growth for these Chinese stocks have actually turned pretty positive. On top of that, we do think that, again, the positive sentiment coming in from a deal being done with the US will likely boost these Chinese stocks up a little bit more. Notwithstanding the fact that, the Shanghai A-shares index is now pretty much at a 10-year high, we do think that the A-shares are likely to do better because of this disparity in valuations between the A and the H shares.
How confident can investors be that the Chinese tech story is insulated from the caprices of US trade policy? Because, yes, sure, US-China trade looking good today, but is it going to still be looking good tomorrow, next week? We really don't know what the future holds here.
Yeah, to a certain extent that's true, but there is a very big difference between how the AI story in the US is playing out and how the AI story in China is playing out. The AI story in the US, if you notice, the hyperscalers have actually moved from an asset-light to an asset-heavy position, whereas in China, the approach is completely different. It's all about open source. It's all about corporates, manufacturers downloading DeepSeek, recoding it, modifying it for their own operations. And that's, in turn, basically contributing to the fact that they are very, very cost-efficient today. And that's why prices have actually not moved very much in China, because they can actually afford to actually bring their prices down a little bit, given the kind of competition that you get in the economy in China, right? And that's one of the reasons why, President Xi Jinping in July introduced the anti-involution drive. So the good news about the US is that the hyperscalers are basically flush with cash. They have very strong balance sheets. They're sitting on tons of cash, and therefore they don't have to actually leverage or borrow to actually fund those roundabout deals that we've been seeing in the last couple of months. On the Chinese side, it is basically the underlying demand that's actually very, very strong, and the speed of implementation amongst the Chinese economy that's actually very, very tremendous, right? You see a more bigger, widespread application of AI in China than you have amongst the general public and amongst the corporates in the US.
Kelvin, how do you feel about Japanese or South Korean tech sectors? Because if, to your point, we sort of go with the taco trade and sideline a bit of the geopolitics, what are you seeing in terms of earnings delivery? We do have a number of these Japanese tech names that are reporting this week as well.
Yeah. I mean, we've always said that, if you want to invest in equities, for example, in general, a certain proportion of that has to be in tech, because of the fact that, tech has actually become a very key part of investment portfolios and a key part of our lives as well. And how do you invest in tech? You have to actually sort it out into 4 different sectors. You have hardware, software, infrastructure, and basically others. And I would say under others, you have basically the blockchain players and potentially cybersecurity as well. South Korea and Japan will basically fall into the hardware space. And in that space, they are basically competing with the likes of the Taiwanese hardware manufacturers, as well as the American semiconductor players as well. And that basically means it's a pretty crowded space. At this point in time, we think that the Japanese and the Korean hardware makers are likely to do well, capitalizing on the kind of growth that we're seeing in the AI story. But on a medium to longer term basis, the South Koreans and the Japanese tech sector, it is not actually very well diversified. It is all pretty much predicated on hardware. So I would say that, you've got to be a little bit more careful where your hardware exposure is concerned with regards to Japan and South Korea. I would be more inclined to actually diversify away from that into the other sectors as we speak, because your overexposure there could potentially be quite cataclysmic if the Japanese yen, for example, suddenly strengthens as a result of President Trump meeting Prime Minister Takaichi this week.
All right, Kelvin Tay, Regional CIO at UBS Global Wealth Management. Thanks, as always, for joining us. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Chinese state media reports say the PBOC will restart its sovereign bond trading operations after a hiatus. Analysts say this may be aimed at supporting the debt market and boosting liquidity. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Lo. Min, what's behind this move?
Well, the reason is because nobody's really interested in the bond market of late, right? There's been so much interest in the stock market. People are rotating away from the bond market, which is a very different story from what we saw back in January when the PBOC had halted bond buying. That was because people were piling into bonds at the time and yields were at record lows over pessimism of the economy. So the concern now is that if the 10-year yield is too high, and that's often an anchor for lending rates and mortgage rates, then that could slow down the economy. And that's why the PBOC is saying that they are going to resume bond trading. And analysts say this could compress that spread between short and long-term yield, create a more healthy yield curve. And obviously, the PBOC is also trying to balance between a healthy stock market and a healthy bond market.
Min's China is also trying to lure more long-term funds to its capital markets as well. What's the plan there?
Yes, the market regulator, the CSRC, has announced that they are coming up with a 2-year plan to do that, and that would include measures such as simplifying the registration and licensing process for foreign investors, allowing them to invest in new products, including some ETF options, commodity futures as well, increasing policy transparency, ensuring equal trading rules for short-term trading as well, and also creating some green channels for certain types of funds, including sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, charity funds, improving the efficiency of transfers, fund transfers and account operations, for example. So a series of measures, but the point is that the government is trying to lure more long-term funds into Chinese capital markets, as the PBOC is also trying to ignite the bond market as well. And this comes as we had seen FDI this year up to September falling about 10% on year in yuan terms. And China has been saying that it wants to continue to open its markets, especially in the context of this trade war with the U.S. Even as the U.S. has been screening and restricting Chinese investments, China wants to do the opposite and try to open its doors even more to foreign investors.
Min Min, thank you. Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Min Lo. Now, of course, we're also anticipating President Trump due to hold his first face-to-face meeting with Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, in Tokyo this hour. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier told his Japanese counterpart that Takaichi's expansionary fiscal stance seems to be helping stocks. Let's go live to Tokyo, and our chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, is standing by for us on this. So, Steve, we are watching out for how Takaichi will engage with Trump. This is, I think, one of her first few diplomatic tests. What are we expecting, and what will they be talking about?
Yeah, so we got that first evidence of the expansionary policies of Takaichi-san in the form of a stock market yesterday that closed well above 50,000, the Nikkei 225, and that is something Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, mentioned, how fortunate he felt he could be in Japan on the day that the Nikkei rose above 50,000. So he did praise some of the policies of Takaichi-san. So in the next half hour, according to local media, about 9:45, Donald Trump will be meeting with the new Prime Minister of Japan. There's lots to talk about on the geopolitical front as well as the economic front and the trade front, no doubt. Defense spending is a key issue for Takaichi-san. Will she talk at length about, speeding up the timeline to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP 2 years earlier than planned? That's something that Donald Trump no doubt would like. But is 2% of GDP enough to assuage his concerns that it's not enough, not like Europe, which is upwards of, or pledging upwards of 5%. So in that same lockstep in that discussion would be issues over North Korea. And of course, as a side note to that, will Donald Trump as well meet Kim Jong-un after APEC in Korea? That's a separate story which we won't delve into right now. The other issue Donald Trump will be raising with her today likely will be trying to convince her to wean Japan off purchases of Russian liquefied natural gas. Now, you can see the schedule there. Donald Trump will be meeting with Takaichi-san today, this morning. Then later this afternoon, will be meeting like he did 6 years ago when he last visited Tokyo, then with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He will be going to a U.S. military ship and essentially addressing the troops, and later will be addressing business leaders as well. One of the big issues, of course, on the financial front or on the trade front will be, will Takaichi-san try and reopen talks about the trade deal that Japan inked in July and solidified in the last couple of months to secure a 15% tariff from the United States in exchange for an investment fund of some $550 billion US dollars. It's been rather opaque what that investment fund would entail. All I have is Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, according to the Nikkei, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, is saying that that investment fund will begin with power. I assume that is energy. So again, we don't have details. I'm sure that will be fleshed out in the face-to-face with Donald Trump today.
Steve, this is coming at the time where Takaichi-san is also seeing pretty solid approval ratings at home. How is this potentially going to affect the way she advances Japanese strategic interests when she meets with the U.S. president?
Well, no doubt that there has been a bit of a revolving door in the premiership in Japan. Kishida, Ishiba had their moments, but essentially could not hold on to the position for very long, not like Shinzo Abe, obviously. And Takaichi-san is a protege of Shinzo Abe. And again, Donald Trump clearly had a good relationship with Shinzo Abe. He often talks fondly about the slain leader who was, of course, assassinated in 2022, as has Takaichi-san. They are cut from the similar cloth, more nationalistic. They want to build up the military budget. There are even words like what Scott Bessent said today, calling it Sanenomics, in a reference, obviously, to Abenomics, expansionary policies. So, again, she's considered to be a strong leader. That latest approval rating from the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, the Nikkei, was at 74%. Yes, it's a honeymoon period. She's been on the job for just about a week. But again, it gives her the confidence to go against another fairly nationalistic leader like Donald Trump on fairly equal footing and a strong backing, obviously. It's unprecedented times in Japan. We have a female prime minister for the first time. We have a female finance minister for the first time. So it'll be very interesting dynamics today over the course of the afternoon.
All right, Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there in Tokyo. Just want to bring you up to speed with one of the stories that we've been following. This is the fortunes of Nidec, still untraded at the moment. Nidec says it's working to strengthen governance and internal control, according to a statement on Tuesday. But this is after the company was placed on special alert by the Tokyo Stock Exchange, set to be removed from the Nikkei 225 index over an ongoing inappropriate accounting scandal. So Nidec shares unchanged at the moment, but once it does begin trading, we could expect to see a substantial slump. Moving in the other direction, EBITDA shares rising as much as 21% at one stage on the news that it will be included in the Nikkei 225. Right, we have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. We've got some live pictures for you here of the Akasaka Palace in Tokyo, where we are awaiting the arrival of President Trump. He will be meeting the Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi there momentarily. So we're just waiting for that meeting to happen, Avril.
Yeah, and when they do meet, I'm sure they'll have a lot to discuss. I mean, some of the outstanding issues between the U.S. and Japan following on from their trade agreement a couple of months back. It includes the implementation of this investment pledge, right? $550 billion worth. Can Japan implement it in a way that would still protect Japanese strategic interests? So certainly a lot on the table when the two leaders meet to discuss this. For the moment, though, a lot of the commentary that we've been getting bilaterally between the two sides ahead of their meeting has been sounding very positive, Paul.
Yeah, on the subject of strategic interests, we've got to talk about rare earths, and we have seen rare earth stocks coming off their highs recently. Of course, on the news that, the US has backed off its threat of 100% tariffs on China, and the quid pro quo has been China has been backing off its rare earths export curbs to the rest of the world. So some of these names elsewhere, particularly here in Australia, are giving up some of the stellar gains that we've seen over the past couple of weeks. Lynas now off by almost 11%. Well, let's discuss a little bit more about the rare earth story. We're joined now by Bloomberg Metals and Mining reporter Martin Ritchie. He's been looking into this, joins us now from Beijing. Martin, for as long as I can remember the rare earth story going on, it's been the same themes. China dominates export and manufacture, the rest of the world lags behind. But is that finally starting to change?
There are some stirrings of that. What we've seen this year in response to these extraordinary export curbs from China and the threat to multiple industries around the world, what we've seen is the start of, I think, more concerted action, both by the US government, some other governments, and by companies themselves, to start really focusing on how we build up a supply chain. So, I recently interviewed several executives across the rare earths industry talking about their plans. There's already a whole kind of wave of new magnet plants, rare earth magnet plants. That's the most important part of the rare earth market. Magnets are used in all sorts of applications. So there's already a number of plants coming on stream in the next few years in the US, or supposed to come on stream. They've been announced. And there's quite a significant amount of capacity if it all comes on stream. But the problem is, and this has been well discussed in the past, is that all the supply chain needs to be built up before that, before you get to the magnets. So there has to be mines, separation plants, refineries, metal plants, everything else. And that's the sort of challenge going forward that people are trying to address, tackle.
Right. Martin, I mean, we are also seeing the U.S. trying to dent the Chinese influence. Just very quickly, if you can, talk to us about where the U.S. is courting or plowing investments into to try and realign the supply chain. We've seen something with Australia, Malaysia more recently, where I am right now as well.
Yeah. So there have been two major events this year. The first was the US investment inside the US in a company called MP Materials, which is a rare earth miner in California. Invested money in that company, directly invested, the US government taking a substantial stake to fund a big new magnets plant there. The second thing was in Australia. You saw deals with Australian companies to develop mining resources, and you'll see a lot of other deals around the world similar to what you've seen in Australia, I would expect.
All right, Bloomberg's Martin Ritchie there. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Let's get you back to live pictures from Tokyo. You are seeing the Akasaka Palace in Tokyo there. There is Scott Bessent, Marco Rubio as well. We are waiting the arrival of President Trump, where, of course, Avril, he'll be having a meeting with Sanae Takaichi. Been a very eventful first week in power for Japan's new Prime Minister.
Yeah, intense. I mean, you're just seeing, right, the likes of Marco Rubio standing in that room awaiting the arrival, I guess, of the U.S. president. And this is coming against the backdrop of course, his Asia tour. He's just come from Malaysia, where I am at the moment, where actually the Japanese Prime Minister was also present. And to your point about how it's been a very intense few days for her, keep in mind as well that this is, I think, seen as quite an early diplomatic test for her. And we haven't really seen or know very much about her experience on the international stage. Now, you're seeing a couple of the other deputies from the U.S. administration there, including the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. And of course, these are among the negotiators that have been engaged with the Chinese side in the past couple of days, interestingly as well, in terms of trying to iron out a trade framework in order for both Trump and Xi to sign something come Thursday, because after Tokyo, of course, the attention does shift towards South Korea. But we are seeing there in the room these U.S. leaders awaiting the arrival of the U.S. president and the Japanese Prime Minister, Paul.
Yeah, certainly a lot of economic crossover between the two at the moment as well. You see Scott Bessent there, the US Treasury Secretary. He had a very good meeting yesterday with Japan's new finance minister as well, where he heaped praise on Sanae economics. It's a horrible word, by the way. Let's call it Abenomics too, maybe, but it's the same sort of thing. He said he was also to be honoured in Japan on the day that the Nikkei topped 50,000 points. But Scott Bessent certainly pleased to see the fiscal stimulus that's going on in Japan at the moment. Also likely commitments towards increased defense spending as well. So certainly before this meeting even gets underway between President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi, a lot of common ground appears to be in place in terms of finance and defense, Avril.
Yeah, to your point about the expectations of expansionary fiscal policy, think about as well what the markets have been positioning given the expectations of what Takaichi's policies are going to look like. And of course, to your point about this being a very eventful week in Japan, not just because they are bracing for the arrival of the U.S. president, we also have a central bank meeting where, of course, it's not expected to move on rates, but that is something that could be figuring into the equation, talking about monetary policy in Japan. But this is, of course, with the underscoring of the geopolitical backdrop. Let's bring in Tobias Harris, founder and principal at political risk advisory firm Japan Foresight. Tobias, we are seeing there in that room those live pictures of the U.S. administration, some of the deputies of Trump waiting the arrival of the U.S. president, hot off his visit to Malaysia, where I am. And this is also, as we've been alluding to, seen as a key test for Takaichi-san. What do we know about how she might seek to engage with the U.S. leader?
Well, this is clearly a moment of transition where you had a pretty challenging start to the second Trump administration for now former Prime Minister Ishiba, where, really had to work very hard to get a trade deal done. And that really, I think, consumed a lot of the energy in the bilateral relationship. And of course, there was, quite a bit of friction at times. So, I think this is really viewed in Tokyo as really an opportunity for a reset, both just because you have a new prime minister, but also just a new prime minister with a new approach, and maybe turning the page on the bilateral relationship is now the focus is how do you implement that trade agreement?
Tobias?
And of course now the focus. Yes.
As you're speaking, we are seeing those two leaders meeting on the red carpet at the palace. Talk about timing, right? And we're seeing the Japanese Prime Minister speaking with U.S. President Trump. But to your point about perhaps what this could mean for the trade deal that was ironed out by the previous administration, are there expectations that potentially there could be a renegotiation of what was ironed out by the previous leadership?
So Takaichi, during the LDP leadership campaign, I think maybe raised some eyebrows when she suggested that might be possible, but she has walked that back and said that if any issues come up or if it seems that the deal is not working in Japan's favor, that she would work within the confines of that agreement, which of course set up a bilateral committee to oversee this investment process. So I think the focus right now is how do we make the agreement that was signed work? How do we hammer out some of the details? How do we get some of the projects off the ground? And that is really where the focus is going to be, of course, this week, but then the end of the year, I think they really want to announce some new projects, get some work started. So that, I think, is going to be the focus right now. And then, of course, now the attention is really giving way to defense cooperation. So both what is Japan doing, to up its contributions to its own defense, and then, of course, I think right around the corner, there's going to be negotiations for a new agreement on host nation support, and that is looming large too.
You talk about defense. There's been some indication that on the Japanese side, they want to potentially up their exports. How would something like this even square away with the U.S. and its tariff policy?
I think for the Japanese government, I think it's probably less about exporting to the United States and probably some other markets. And of course, we've seen a lot of interest and a lot of cooperation between European countries and Japan. And so I think that's a possibility. Of course, they just signed a major agreement to sell frigates to Australia. That, I think, was landmark. Lots of, gradual ramping up sales of different kinds of equipment to Southeast Asia. So I think, these are the kind of markets that Japan's producers, I think, would be eyeing. But really, I think also, you you need the kind of scale that would allow Japanese producers to really sell and reduce the cost that Japanese companies or the Japanese government has to pay to buy from their own companies, because of course they've really only had the Japanese government as their customer for all these years. And so I think really being able to capture greater scale is I think the dream, which would lower per unit cost for the Japanese government. And so that I think ultimately is where they would like to get to. But it's still, this has been a long-term project of expanding Japan's arms exports, and they still have maybe a long way to go, even though you've now had some landmark sales.
And, Prime Minister Takaichi as well. I mean, she's only 1 week in the job. Getting there was a bit of a torturous process as well. Her government's not in a particularly strong position either. How domestically popular are these ideas like lifting defence spending? Are there some risks for her here?
I think there are absolutely some risks. And, of course, she's really tried right out the gate, saying that she's going to try to get to 2% of GDP during the current fiscal year with a supplemental budget instead of waiting until fiscal 27, which would be a pretty ambitious project. And then, of course, really moving up the process of laying out a pathway to going beyond 2% in the next defense spending plan. But the problem is the LDP, even with majorities in the Diet, couldn't really come to an agreement about how to pay for that higher defense spending. They still really haven't come to an agreement. Of course, they came up with some tax increases. Those actually haven't been implemented yet, so you're still waiting for that. And so figuring out how exactly you're going to get beyond 2% of GDP, I think you're asking a really big political question where, I think the public is okay with the idea of maybe spending more for defense, but once you start probing, should we issue more debt? Should we raise taxes? Should we try to economize it? It's not really clear where the funding for those defense spending increases are going to come from. So that really is the challenge, and it's going to be really hard for a government that still doesn't quite have a majority. I mean, they're closer, but it's going to be a big political lift. And so it's one thing to make these kind of promises now in the summit. It's going to be a much harder question over the longer term, trying to figure out where the money to pay for it's going to come from.
Tobias, of course, Japan is involved in a defence arrangement of sorts, along with India and Australia as well, known as the Quad. And, of course, the US and India having some disagreements over trade policy at the moment. Is there a role for Japan here and Prime Minister Takaichi to smooth over those differences and hold the Quad together?
I mean, I think the question is, you have a U.S. administration that clearly prefers to work on a bilateral basis with countries, and certainly the president prefers to work on a bilateral basis with countries. And so I think that already makes it maybe a little difficult for any third party to really play an intermediary role here. I mean, I think there is some question, too, about what role the Quad exactly is playing, because, of course, before the transition from Biden to Trump, it wasn't quite a defense arrangement. They were doing lots of work on supply chains and resilience and regional collective goods, let's call them. It's not clear how invested this administration really is in carrying that work forward, versus, making these bilateral arrangements with countries, feeling can get better deals for the U.S. in that setting instead of in a multilateral. So I think that's a real question going forward of just how much energy the U.S. is willing to put into the Quad. I know there's some question about getting a Quad leaders meeting on the agenda at some point, through the end of the year. It's not clear when that's going to happen. So, I mean, if whether Japan is actually really able to rely on the Quad as a vehicle for advancing its interest in the region, I think is a big question. We'll see lots of bilateral and maybe trilateral cooperation between Japan and different partners. We saw, of course, meetings with Takaichi in Kuala Lumpur over the weekend. That I think is an important work that was continuing even when Ishiba was a lame duck. So we should expect more of that. But I'm not quite clear how involved the United States is going to be really at the leader level in carrying that work forward.
We know how she's seen as having pretty hawkish defense policies, and it's interesting how this might actually endear her to Trump, as he's been advocating for economies to up their defense spending. But talk to us a bit more about how this might run up into the fiscal constraints and the realities there.
And that's really the key question, because you do have, I think, an appreciation in Tokyo, and not just, this is not just a, conservative hawks think this. I mean, I think Ishiba was moving in this direction. I think other parts of the political system recognize that actually Japan does need to maybe take some more responsibility. It really needs to have more advanced capabilities. It needs to have partnerships throughout the region, not just with the United States. We of course saw a pretty significant visit by the Royal Navy to Japan in August. That, I think, really laid the groundwork for closer Japan-UK defense ties. So I think there is a consensus really across the board, for the most part, for Japan to do more. But I think there is an appreciation in Japan that also there's still no substitute for the United States remaining engaged to Japan's security and having forces forward deployed in the region. Of course, later on Tuesday, the president is going to go out to Yokosuka and visit U.S. troops there. So I mean, there is this belief that Japan has to do more. It's really almost obligatory. It can't assume that the United States is going to be there forever or going to be fully willing to commit to regional security, but also Japan needs to try to keep the United States engaged. And so part of that is being able to show the ways in which Japan is committing to its security. And so trying to walk that tightrope is going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge for Takaichi. It's going to be a challenge for future leaders, to show, we need you here, but also you're not going to be alone. We are here. We are committed. We are willing to invest in our defense. And yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, just the fiscal balance, in figuring out where the political support is going to come from to pay for this, it's just a huge question. Is the Japanese public really willing to step up, whether that means higher taxes, whether that means tolerating higher debt? I mean, these are huge questions that there's just not a really strong political consensus for right now.
What about when it comes to, you talk about investments, right? And I think one of the elephants in the room, the $550 billion investment pledge, whether Japan can, at this point, set the stage so that, on one hand, it doesn't draw the ire of Trump, but on the other, also make sure that whatever investments it engages in are in Japan's strategic interests. How does Takaichi-san toe the line or balance these priorities?
It's not going to be easy, and I think both the government and public financial institutions have, of course, been taking soundings of the business community, trying to find maybe some low-hanging fruit, some projects and some partners that could be some early wins that Japan could then show to the Trump administration and say, we are on board with this. This is the form it's going to take. But really, I mean, I think in part because the lame duck period for the Ishiba government, I think, put so much of this on hold that, we don't really still have a strong sense of how exactly this process is going to work. Putting projects forward, presenting them to the president to pick which projects he thinks, are the best. We got a little more detail from Commerce Secretary Lutnick in a conversation with Nikkei, talking about the kind of projects, strategic infrastructure, pipelines, things like that. All of that sounds good, but, of course, this, for example, one project that keeps coming up with is this Alaska LNG project that, Japanese companies have had a lot of time to think about it, and they've faced a lot of pressure to contribute to it. And, thus far, they've felt it's not economical. So the question is there a way to maybe cover some of the risk that they see that's led them to resist investing so far, to maybe then take on that project as a sign that we are committed to these investments, to being involved in these projects. But really, I mean, there's a lot of issues here to navigate between the private sector, between the restrictions that Japanese public financial institutions face. They can only take so much risk on their balance sheets. I mean, these are real questions that can't just be hand waved away. And this is now Takaichi's problem to manage.
Tobias, on the topic of strategy, we're hearing local media in Japan this morning reporting that Sanae Takaichi plans to recommend President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. To what degree does this suggest they understand who they're dealing with?
I suppose maybe that's not that shouldn't come as a surprise. No, I think they understand him well, and I think she got to watch her mentor, the late Shinzo Abe, dealing with Trump, the kind of relationship that he forged with Trump, and the kind of work that he put in to having that sort of relationship of trust with Trump. And so I think she's going to really work to that end, to try to show that she's a good friend, that Japan is a good friend, that Japan is seriously committed to the relationship, that seriously appreciates his leadership, and she's going to work to that end. And of course, we're going to see, lots of reminders of the relationship that Trump had with Abe in, the next day or so, as they talk, as they revisit and reflect upon that relationship. And we've already seen, I think, even when Ishiba was meeting with Trump, Trump would go off on, recollections about his relationship with Abe. So clearly, there is feeling there, and there's feeling that Takaichi, I think, maybe will be able to use to help show Trump that that she can be trusted, that she's a friend, and that she's committed. So I think maybe nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize is probably a pretty easy step for her to take to show that she is willing to go to the lengths really that Abe did to have that kind of relationship with Trump.
All right, Tobias Harris, principal at Japan Foresight, please do stay with us. We are anticipating there may be some remarks from President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi. We will bring you those as we get them. There is more ahead on the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg. Let's take a look at how our assets in Japan are tracking at the moment. A little bit of weakness for the Nikkei today, although to be fair, it's been a huge run-up. We're off by about 0.25% at the moment. Just a special mention of Nidec, the story we've been bringing you today. Nidec, a manufacturer of precision motors, has been designated a security on special alert. What it means is it's being taken out of the Nikkei 225 from November the 5th. It's going to be replaced by another company, Ibiden, an electronics component company, but we're seeing Nidec falling about 19% on the news of that. It's being delisted as a result of accounting inconsistencies. So Nidec still under investigation. We've got a very weak yen still, 152.43, really helping, giving it a tailwind to Japanese assets as well. Let's get back now to Tobias Harris, founder and principal at political risk advisory firm Japan Foresight, as this meeting between Sanae Takaichi and President Trump about to get underway. Tobias, what are the metrics here for a successful meeting? What would that look like?
A lot of it is going to be the optics, I think, to start. Just what is their comfort level with each other? What does their rapport look like? Frankly, I think one of the bars is, does Trump actually use her name? Because one of the questions that there was, that Ishiba got about his relationship with Trump is that Trump was regularly just calling him the Prime Minister, Mr. Prime Minister, wasn't really even using his name. And believe me, that got remarked upon by the Japanese press. And so I think, watching, does there actually look like a sort of genuine rapport between them? Do they, are they basically reflecting upon their shared affection for the late Prime Minister Abe? Is there an expression maybe of appreciation for some of the things that Takaichi said in her, in the first week as Prime Minister? So of course, you're talking about raising defense spending, her commitment to the trade agreement. What is it? What is their interaction like? What does it look like? Does Takaichi look like a strong leader next to Trump? I think, these are the kind of things that everyone's going to be watching for, because it's so early in her tenure and everyone's really trying to see what she looks like as Japan's diplomat-in-chief.
And what's also interesting is how she is, for the moment, enjoying pretty solid approval ratings. Is this part of a honeymoon period, as one of our colleagues had been suggesting earlier? And how much confidence does this give her when she negotiates with the U.S. president?
Well, it's a great place to start for her, and certainly in most polls she ranks among, it's one of the best starts in polls, basically for the last quarter century. I mean, among, in the top 2 or 3 in some polls. So I mean, it's a great position for her to be in, given some of the anxiety around her taking over, and certainly the challenges the LDP has faced. I mean, they're certainly a little happier having a prime minister with approval ratings around 70%. So it's a great place for her to be in going into this meeting. Of course, if she comes out of this meeting, there's not that much more room to go up, but if she has a successful meeting, it certainly will allow her to sustain those numbers for longer, and that maybe then gives her some momentum going into the remainder of the diet session, where she really is going to have to fight it out to get a supplemental budget passed. And if she's got a little more the public behind her, a little more political capital to play with, she's going to get her way, more often than not as those fights unfold. That's not a bad place to be in. And really, if it actually looks sustainable for a long time, Then you start getting to December, and if she gets a supplemental budget that looks good and it looks like it's really satisfying the public's interest in what they want, maybe then she starts thinking about calling a snap election that gets the LDP back to a majority. So that really is, I'm not going to say everything is riding on this meeting because she's already in good shape, even before this meeting. And I think it just has to feel like a successful summit for her to come out of it, in a strong position. But certainly if she gets an extra little tailwind here, it could really make a big difference, in 6 or 8 weeks' time.
We also have to talk about President Trump's next destination, which is to meet Xi Jinping of China. How is that relationship going to inform Japan's relationship with China going forward?
Japan, I think, is probably of two minds ultimately when it comes to the U.S.-China trade war and just the broader competition between the U.S. and China. On the one hand, I think there's concern when it gets too fierce and too intense, and there's too much maybe pushing towards maybe decoupling or in the direction of decoupling, because frankly, Japan is not in a position to decouple. It is really not it's a political non-starter domestically. Corporate Japan needs China, needs to be able to sell to China, certainly produces a lot in China. And so that, Japan needs some relief from the tensions between the U.S. and China, I think. But of course, you don't want things to go too far in the other direction either. And there's certainly plenty of anxiety about the possibility of some sort of strategic grand bargain that maybe reduced confidence that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in the event of some sort of crisis in the Taiwan Strait. And so they're trying to find the happy medium where the U.S. is still defending China's neighbors from Chinese security threats, military threats, but also trying to dial back some of the trade tensions, not have quite as much friction when it comes to slapping up tariffs or export controls or investment controls, whatever the tool of choice is.
All right, Tobias, just hold that thought. We're just going to briefly listen into some of the remarks that we're hearing at Akasaka Palace at the moment. Let's listen.
ダイナミックな外交について話を聞いていました。タイとカンボジアの停戦に成功し、トランプ大統領はまずアジアの平和に貢献をされました。それから先般の中東における合意の実現もですね、これはかつてない歴史的偉業です。
As a matter of fact, Prime Minister Abe often told me about your dynamic diplomacy. Most recently, Mr. President succeeded in securing a ceasefire deal between Thailand and Cambodia and contributed to ensuring peace in Asia. Also, the deal you have recently achieved in the Middle East is an unprecedented historic achievement.
これだけの短期間に世界がより平和になりました。でこの世界の平和と安定のトランプ大統領の揺るぎないコミットを高く評価します。で私自身も強い感銘を受けました。
In such a short period of time, the world started to enjoy more peace on the ground. And in this context, I highly value your unwavering commitment towards peace and stability. I, myself, was so impressed and inspired by you, Mr. President.
今や、日米は世界で最も偉大な同盟になりました。で日本も共に、世界の平和と繁栄に貢献をしてまいります。
Now both Japan and the United States have developed the greatest alliance in the world. And together with you, Japan is ready to contribute towards peace and stability.
私は日本の国益を守り抜くためにも強い日本外交を取り戻す決意です。そして自由で開かれたインド太平洋の進展に向けても日米でさらに協力を進めたいと考えています。
On diplomacy, I am determined to restore dynamic Japan's diplomacy to protect Japan's own national interests. In addition, I am ready to promote further collaboration with you and with the United States toward our shared goal of achieving a free and open Indo-Pacific.
私はこれから日本の国力、つまり外交力、防衛力、経済力、技術力、情報力、人材力を強くするリーダーとして働いてまいる決意です。
So let me share with you my determination. I will continue to strive as the leader of Japan to strengthen Japan's national power, namely diplomacy, defense capabilities, economic power, technology, intelligence, and human resources.
来年は、米国建国250周年、ですよね。で、共に、日本も共に盛大にお祝いをしたいと思っております。ワシントン DC に250本の桜を、寄付する予定です。それからまた来年7月4日にはワシントン DC で日本の秋田県の花火が打ち上げられると聞いております。
Next year, the United States will mark the semi-quincentennial anniversary. Japan and I would like to join the United States to have a magnificent celebration. We'll extend a gift of 250 cherry trees to Washington, D.C. In addition, I understand that fireworks from Japan, from Akita Prefecture, will be shown in Washington, D.C. on July 4th next year.
日本とアメリカを、より強く豊かにするために、日米同盟の新たな黄金時代をトランプ大統領とともに作り上げていきたいと願っております。ありがとう。
Through these efforts, together with you, Mr. President, I would like to realize a new golden age of Japan-US alliance where both Japan and the United States will become stronger and also more prosperous. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you very much, and I want to congratulate you. As you know, Shinzo Abe was a great friend of mine. To congratulate you. As you know, Shinzo Abe was a great friend of mine, and I was very saddened to see what happened. It was so shocking, but he spoke so well of you, even before we knew what was going to happen and your ascension. He spoke so well of you long before we met, and I'm not surprised to see that you are now the Prime Minister, and he would be very happy to know that, and I congratulate you on behalf of the United States of America.
総理ありがとうございます。まずご着任の、に対して祝したいと思います。晋三は私にとって非常に素晴らしい友人でありました。本当に、彼が亡くなったことはショッキングであり悲しい出来事でありました。また、安倍晋三氏からは、かなり、総理のことを、よく、話されておられました。ですのでお会いする前から、総理になるということを、私が知る前から素晴らしい話をよく聞いております。ですので晋三氏もかなり喜んでいらっしゃると思いますし、米側を代表して私の方からも祝したいと思います。
I know that you are increasing your military capacity very substantially, and we've received your orders for a very large amount of new military equipment, and you know that we make the best military equipment in the world, the jets, the missiles, and everything else, and hopefully we don't have to use them very much, if at all. But we appreciate that order, and we very much appreciate the trade. We're going to do tremendous trade together, I think more than ever before. We're just signing a new deal, and it's a very fair deal, and we look forward to welcoming Japan into the United States and a continuation, and it's something that everybody is very, very excited about.
また、日本の方も、かなり自衛隊や防衛費に関して、増加をされるということで、聞いております。このほか米国から装備品の調達をされるということで、もちろん米国はベストな、戦闘機、ミサイル等を持っております。もちろん使いたくはないのですけれども、このような調達に関しても感謝申し上げたいと思います。貿易に関してもこれから増えていくことかと思います。また貿易協定の署名式もこれからなされる予定であります。非常に公平なこの協定になっていると思っておりますので、これからもこのような関係を継続していきながら非常にエキサイティングな時代になっていくと思います。
I have always had a great love of Japan and a great respect of Japan. And I will say that this will be a relationship that will be stronger than ever before, and I look forward to working with you. And on behalf of our country, I want to just let you know, anytime you have any question, any doubt, anything you want, any favors you need, anything I can do to help Japan, we will be there. We are an ally at the strongest level, and it's a great honor to be with you, especially so early in what will be, I think, one of the greatest prime ministers. I think you will be one of the great, everything I know, from Shinzo and others, you will be one of the great prime ministers. I'd also like to congratulate you on being the first woman prime minister. That's a big deal. That's a big deal, and I want to congratulate you on that. I think that has to be called out. And you're going to do a fantastic job, and we're going to have a fantastic relationship. Thank you very much.
私は日本を愛してますし、非常に日本という国を尊敬しております。私たちの関係はこれから今まで以上に強力なものになっていくと思います。またお伝えしたいことは何らかの質問もしくは疑問、何か私たちでできることがあれば何なりと言っていただきたいと思います。日本は私たちにとって最も重要な同盟国であり、また総理にこのような早い段階でお会いできることを光栄に思っております。また、安倍晋三氏も言っておりましたけれども、非常に素晴らしい話を聞いております。ですので、高市総理はこれから目を馳せる総理になっていくと私は確信しております。また初めての女性総理ということで、これは非常にビッグディールだと私も思っておりますので、大きな期待を持っております。
Thank you. Thank you very much.